Welcome everybody, this is SharePoint Patterns and Practices Webcast, and this time I will be concentrating how to consume SharePoint Online via the Microsoft Graph. So essentially concentrate on looking into what are the APIs in the Microsoft Graph, the unified API for accessing Office 365 and other services to watch SharePoint Online. My name is Vesa Juvonen, I'm a Senior Program Manager from SharePoint Engineering, and with me today as a primary presenter is Paolo Pialorsi. So Paolo, will you do the quick intros as well?
Yes, thank you, Vesa, and welcome everybody. I'm Paolo Pialorsi. I'm a senior consultant working in a company of my own called psys.com, and I'm an MVP on Office Server and Services, as well as a member of PnP, the PnP community project.
Excellent. Thank you, Paolo. So, like mentioned, we're going to deep dive, well, we're not going to deep dive, we're going to actually go through what are the APIs towards SharePoint Online in the Microsoft Graph and how you can actually use them. So we'll have live demos after a few slides, and then we'll use the Fiddler and also C# console application to do stuff. Obviously, you can use Microsoft Graph using whatever technologies because it's an HTTP API, so you can just post and get stuff and operate towards Microsoft Graph. But now I'll let actually Paolo do the presentation and also the demo, and I'll jump in as needed with random questions. So curveballs while Paolo is presenting. So Paolo, please take it away.
Thank you, Vesa. So, yes, as we said, in Microsoft Graph, we have support for consuming SharePoint Online and SharePoint Online content. The important thing to know is that the support provided by Graph is available in version 1.0 of the Microsoft Graph. So it is globally available. It is not a beta set of services. It is a fully released set of services that you can use in your production environment. The actions available through the Microsoft Graph in order to consume SharePoint Online nowadays, or at least at the time of this recording, are, first of all, actions to access the site. So to get a specific site and some information about a site, to get the lists of lists in a site or of sub-sites in a site. Moreover, to target the lists, you can get a specific list or the items inside of a list, or you can even create a new list in a target site. From a list item perspective, you can create, update, or delete single items in a list of a site. And when those items are files or documents, there are a bunch of functionalities provided through the Files API to get, upload, delete, move, or copy a file. You can even convert a file into PDF. You can, of course, list the files so that you can then get any specific file that you are interested in. And you can, of course, create folders in which you will be able to upload or access files. So quite a wide set of functionalities to access the main content that you have in SharePoint Online through the Microsoft Graph.
And on that one, actually, Paolo, so like you said, this is quite a wide set of APIs. So if you're let's say, if you're not a Microsoft SharePoint, if you're not a SharePoint person, you'll be like, yeah, that's what SharePoint is all about. It's all about sites and lists and list items and then files and folders. So, okay, that's fine. So we are kind of covering the whole SharePoint. But now, if you are a SharePoint person, you will be looking at this and be like, okay, so how do I create a content type? How do I actually associate a field to the list, and how do I do all of the more complex operations in the SharePoint, which people are quite used to do using even the server-side APIs back in on-premises. So, and that's a fair discussion, obviously. That okay, why is the Graph API much more limited than the native REST or CSM APIs in Microsoft? And on that one, we actually probably should have had a quick slide on explaining how all of this works. But basically how this works is that for Microsoft Graph, whenever there's a service, it doesn't matter if it's an Intune or Azure AD or SharePoint or OneDrive or whatever, there has to be obviously a native API. In this case, there is actually a set of native APIs in SharePoint's online site, which the Graph is hitting as well. So the Graph is just an abstraction layer on top of the SharePoint. And that means that there always has to be the native APIs on the service, like the REST APIs in SharePoint, and then there will be the Graph APIs, which is kind of a double work when you think of it from an engineering perspective. So for Microsoft, that's a double work because we need to encapsulate the operations. But the whole point is that you as a consumer, as a developer on top of the Microsoft Graph, you don't have to worry about it. You just use the Graph, you authenticate towards Graph, and we'll make sure that all of the plumbing works towards whatever services you want to access, which is absolutely brilliant. But it actually does bring the challenge of how do we make sure that we add and have all of the needed APIs in the Microsoft Graph, because that requires a lot of resources. And for now, like we've gone through, right now it is a basic set of operations which are through the Microsoft Graph towards SharePoint Online. Potentially in future there will be additional APIs. So please have a look on our beta endpoint on the Microsoft Graph, what will be coming towards the SharePoint. So you can think the content types and fields potentially might be coming, and a few other operations as well. Now, in the full transparency on these things, if you will need to have full access on the full scale of SharePoint Online APIs, you most likely need to always fall back on the CSAM or REST APIs, so the native APIs, when you really need to configure, let's say, regional calendar settings of a site or language settings of a site. Will those never be exposed to Graph? We'll see, but those are always exposed at least through the native APIs. Was that clear enough explanation?
Yeah, I think so. And let me just add one more thing, one more side note. Regardless, you will use the Microsoft Graph or the SharePoint REST APIs or whatever else API for whatever else service provided by Office 365. One key message, in my opinion, is also that under the cover there will always be Azure Active Directory. So once you have your application registered, once you have your security handshake in place, and you have an access token to consume those APIs, you will be able to flip from one API to the other just using Open Authorization and Azure AD in a unique shared authorization context. That's the key feature of the Microsoft Graph and of Azure AD more in general.
Correct. So, and just to reiterate on that one, using just my words, basically, if you are accessing Microsoft Graph APIs and there's an API which isn't exposed through the Microsoft Graph, you can take the access token and use that against the native APIs. So that won't be a problem because you don't need to have double-step authentication and all of that. So all good from that perspective. So just reiterating the message.
Yeah, absolutely. One more is better than one less.
Absolutely.
Cool. So how to consume those APIs from a developer perspective? As we were talking about a few seconds ago, you need to register an application in Azure Active Directory so that once you will have an application registered there, you will be able to configure proper permissions to access the actions that you need to consume. So, for example, there are permissions to read the content of site. There are permissions to read and write content if you want to have write access, to manage or to have even full control on all of the site collections in your SharePoint Online tenant. There are a bunch of permissions dedicated to the file access, to have access to read, write again, or to do all of the operation that you need to do against files, either whether they are in OneDrive or in SharePoint Online. So based on what you need to do, you can configure your permissions. And again, thinking about what we said a few seconds ago, whenever you want to switch from one API to the other, of course, you will need to have proper permissions. And once you will have your application registered with proper permissions, you will be able to have an handshake with the Open Authorization Protocol, or better, the OpenID Connect protocol, and then through the Open Authorization Protocol, you will get an access token. And the access token, together with the refresh token, will let you make requests targeting your target API, or through the refresh token, you will be able to get a new access token to consume another API. So, for example, you make an handshake, you get an access token for the Microsoft Graph, and you are free to use the resources for which you have proper permissions. Then you want to switch to the SharePoint REST APIs. Using the refresh token, you will be able to get another access token to consume the native SharePoint Online REST APIs, all within the same authentication context. So from a development perspective and from an end user perspective, there will be just one login, one authentication phase, and then the freedom to consume all of the services for which you have proper permissions.
Now, before we go forward on here, just to be super specific, because some of the viewers might have actually seen that in early 2018, we released a capability, at least to preview, and it's coming to GA, well, depending on the timing, depending again when you're watching the video, but we released the capability of accessing Azure AD operations through SharePoint framework. And just to be super clear, this guidance, what you're seeing here, is when you have a separate application. So if you're using and if you want to access Azure Microsoft Graph APIs and scopes using the SharePoint framework in the context of SharePoint as a client-side web part or an extension, the story is different. So you don't actually need to register an Azure AD application. This guidance applies when you're writing a separate application which is accessing the graph.
Yeah, when you're developing your own custom solutions, yeah.
Correct.
Not
correct.
when using SharePoint framework, correct.
Correct.
So, once you have your application registered, you have your permissions configured, you do the handshake, you get the access token, and then you're ready to consume the Microsoft Graph API, included the actions that cover the content available in SharePoint Online. When you use the Graph API to consume SharePoint Online, there is something to keep in your mind, because as we said before, the Microsoft Graph is a kind of a smart wrapper on top of the native services of all of the services provided by Office 365. For example, when you consume SharePoint Online, you have to identify your target tenant, your target site collection, and your target site using a specific site ID, which is a URL parameter that you have to provide to the graph in order to target the right tenant and the right site, of course, as long as you have access to that content. So, and we will see it pretty soon moving to the demo environment, because there is a specific syntax that you need to keep in your mind in order to consume SharePoint Online through Graph. So, if you do agree, Visa, we can move to the demo environment and we can see how to play with those APIs with a .NET application, as well as using, for example, Fiddler with low-level HTTP and REST requests.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
So, let me move to my demo environment. This is a SharePoint Online site collection, and I will consume and use this site collection using the Graph endpoint. First of all, I will use Fiddler. So here in Fiddler, I already have a few requests pre-configured just to show you the syntax. And first of all, as we said, in order to consume the APIs, we need a registered application. That's what we have. If I go quickly back to my browser, in the Azure Management Portal, under the Azure Active Directory area, and in application registration, I have a pre-configured application. If I go to see what is this application and how it is configured, I can see in the settings area that under the required permissions section, I have permissions for the Microsoft Graph. And if I go through all of the permission, I can see that I have, for example, in the delegated permission section, there are a bunch of permissions available. I have full control of all site collections, because for the sake of demo purposes, I'm a little bit lazy. I gave me whatever permission I needed so that I can do almost everything. But of course, it is up to you to define proper and fine-grained permissions for what you really need to do. So using this application and using the application ID, the client ID of this application, and the share secret of this application, I was able to get an access token from Azure Active Directory. So that now I can make a REST request, for example, for graph.microsoft.com version 1.0, which is the base URL of the version 1.0 of Graph. Then I can say sites to target the site collections, and or the sites, not only the site collections. And first of all, I have to provide the target tenant followed by the relative URL of the site that I have in target for my request. And of course, from an open authorization perspective, I have to provide an HTTP header of type authorization with a bearer access token inside of it. Making such kind of request, I will get back a JSON message, a JSON response, which will be made of a set of information about the site that I am targeting. As you can see here, there is a property called ID, which is built joining the tenant name and a couple of GUID. The first GUID is the site collection ID, and the second GUID is the website ID within the site collection. So if you think about the native SharePoint REST APIs, usually you can target a site in a site collection using the site ID and the site collection ID. And it is exactly what is needed by Graph to target toward the REST APIs of SharePoint, the native APIs, to retrieve a reference to the site that we have in target. You can so use this syntax based on the relative URL of the site for the ID of the site that you target, or you can even use that ID. So you can use site / the name of your tenant, the global unique identifier of the site collection, and the global unique identifier of the target site. This is exactly the same, and it will give you exactly the same result as before. Moreover, if you want to access, for example, the collection of lists, once you have your target site, you can just ask for the collection of lists, adding /lists to the URL and still providing the access token, and you will be able to get back, you can make a GET request and get back the collection of lists. Or you can even make a POST request. You can provide a JSON request body, which will, for example, define that you want to create a new list, which will be a generic list with a specific name and with a couple of custom columns, just for the sake of making an example. And by making a POST request targeting the collection of lists in a site, you will be able to create a new list in the site. And in fact, if you see, now we have got back a confirmation, the list has been created, and we got back a JSON content which will define the basic information of the just created list. And in fact, if I go back to my browser, if I go to the site contents of this target site collection, we can see that I have a customers list, which is the one I have just created using the Microsoft Graph APIs. We can do that with whatever technology you like, as long as you have HTTP and REST support. You can do that even using .NET Framework, for example, and that's why here we have an ASP.NET MVC application, which will be available pretty soon based on the time of this recording in the PnP samples repo. And through this application, you can play with .NET Code, with C#, with your target SharePoint Online using the Microsoft Graph APIs for SharePoint. So for example, I can get the relative URL of my target site. I can use this one as the site URL to get a reference to the site. And as you can see, I can get the ID of the object. I can even use the ID rather than the relative URL. I can for sure improve the UI of this sample application, but I'm a developer, I'm not a designer, and I'm sorry about that. From here you can see the list of lists that you have, and you can even create on the fly a new list using exactly the same technique as before. So if we go back and we refresh the list of lists, as you can see, we have a new one which has been created right now during the recording of this webcast, and this is the link to our list. From a source code perspective, we have the application registered, we have the client ID, and we should have a shared secret and all the stuff needed to use Azure Active Directory for authentication and authorization purposes. So we use Azure Active Directory Authentication Library, ADAL, for .NET. And once we have an access token through ADAL, we can simply use low-level HTTP requests to get access to the sites or to get access to the lists of a specific site identified by ID. And bear in mind that when you get a reference to a site, you can use either the relative URL or the ID, so the relative URL or the ID of the site. But when you want to access the lists, when you want to create new artifacts in the target site, you will need to use the ID, so the tenant name, comma, the GUID of the site collection, comma, the GUID of the site, because the relative URL will not work, at least doesn't work yet. I don't know if there is any plan to support that one, but I think it is not really needed, because once you have the relative URL, you get the ID, and through the ID, you can consume the full set of APIs. So under the cover of those helper methods, we just have the HTTP client object of .NET in place, and I will not dig into all of the details of the code, but I simply make an HTTP request, and using an HTTP client, I can make a request and process the response that I will get back. So pretty easy from a REST consumption perspective. You make an HTTP REST request, you get back typically a JSON response, you process the JSON response with Newton JSON serializer, for example, and you are good to go. You can play with the APIs. I think that's it from a demo perspective, just to let you know what you can do nowadays with those APIs and to give you the idea of what you need to do to consume SharePoint Online through the Microsoft Graph. Anything else to add, Visa?
No, I think this is it. This is sufficient, and like I said, we'll have links also to the sample code, which will be then available from the PnP gallery, so sample gallery. So you can easily then play around and test these things as you are investigating how things can be done. So, and like Paolo said, obviously in this case we're using ASP.NET MVC or ASP MVC, but you can use whatever technologies as long as it's an HTTP REST API based implementation. So, but I think that's it. Cool.
So we can flip back to the slide deck.
Yes, let's do that.
Say thank you.
Yes. So like I said, like we started the webcast. So this was really around covering what currently is available in the Microsoft Graph towards the SharePoint Online. The list, depending on when you're watching the video, the list might has been already changed and it's evolving. So please have a look always on the documentation through the Microsoft Graph official documentation. What is the latest being supported there? Now on the maybe just a pinpoint on the different scopes and areas. So if you're looking into getting files in the library or the files in the library, those are actually underneath the OneDrive documentation, which might feel strange, but there's a historical reasons and ownership reasons behind of that. So the files within a SharePoint are kind of owned, the access to those files is owned by the OneDrive team, and that's why the file access is through the /OneDrive in the documentation as well, or in the Graph APIs. But anything else, Paolo?
No, I think that's it. Thank you for watching. Have fun with SharePoint Online and Graph, and nothing more than that.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for watching, and we'll come up with a new webcast sooner or later. Thank you. Bye-bye.